At first light on March 15, 1941, infantry of the 4th and 5th Indian Divisions began climbing a mountain in Eritrea. The ground was granite. Above them, on Mount Sanchil and along the ridges either side of the Dongolas Gorge, Italian grenadiers and battalions of Eritrean askaris waited behind stone breastworks with the elevation, the range, and the time to use both. Water came up the slope by mule, in canvas bags slung over the saddle, along tracks cut into rock by hand. Every round fired on those ridges had been carried up on the back of an animal or a man. The battle for Keren lasted 8 weeks and cost the Allied force somewhere near 4,000 killed and wounded. Italian and Eritrean losses were heavier. Orlando Lorenzini, a general who had made his name in Libya and whom Rome's newspapers called the Lion of the Sahara, was killed on the ridge on the 17th of March. When Keren fell on the 27th of March, the road opened to Asmara and to Massawa, the Red Sea port Britain needed if it meant to keep Egypt supplied. Almost nobody outside those regiments remembers it. What survives in public memory of the war in Africa is a strip of coastal desert, 2 commanders and columns of tanks crossing sand. Rommel, Montgomery, El Alamein. That version fits on one map. The campaign it belongs to ran from June 1940 to May 1943 across mountains, harbors, railway lines, olive groves, and internment camps, and it was fought by armies raised in Kenya and the Punjab, in Eritrea and Chad, in Sudan, Nyasaland, Senegal, Auckland, and Adelaide. Behind them worked dockers, drivers, railwaymen, porters, and forced laborers whose names were, in most cases, never written down. This is the campaign underneath the map. Who fought it, who paid for it, and how a continent held by European empires was made to supply a war it had no vote in. Look at Africa in 1939 and count the independent states. There are 2, Liberia and Egypt, whose sovereignty was formal enough to print on documents, and thin enough that British troops sat astride the Suez Canal under the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936. Ethiopia had been independent until 1935. South Africa governed itself as a dominion under a franchise that excluded the overwhelming majority of the people living in it. Everything else belonged to somebody in Europe. Britain held a band of territory from Egypt and Sudan down through East Africa to the Union. France ruled most of the north and west. Belgium held the Congo. Portugal held Angola and Mozambique. Spain held enclaves in Morocco and the Western Sahara. Italy held Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia, and since 1936 had occupied Ethiopia. Those borders were the settlement of conquests still inside living memory. Italian rule in Libya was imposed across 2 decades of war, deportation, and internment. In the early 1930s, the population of the Cyrenaican interior was driven into camps on the coastal desert, and tens of thousands died in them. Ethiopia was invaded in 1935 by an army that dropped mustard gas from aircraft onto soldiers, villages, and Red Cross positions, and that went on conducting reprisal executions for years after Addis Ababa fell. The machinery built to hold that ground turned out to be the machinery a modern war required. Colonial administration already knew how to raise soldiers, count the taxable men in a district, requisition grain and cattle, direct labor to a railhead, and arrest the people who objected. When Mussolini declared war in June 1940, none of it had to be invented. It was standing there, staffed and running, and both sides used it. What made the region worth the effort was geography. The Suez Canal joined Britain to India, Australia, Malaya, and the oil fields of Iraq and Iran. Egypt held the bases, the workshops, the airfields, and the port of Alexandria. An open Mediterranean shortened Britain's imperial supply line by weeks. A closed one pushed every convoy around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 12,000 kilometers to the voyage and consuming shipping Britain could not spare. For Italy, Africa promised the empire Mussolini had been promising his public for 15 years. For Germany, arriving later and without enthusiasm, North Africa offered a way to hold British attention and keep an ally standing. For the people who lived there, the question was narrower. Which army was coming? What would it take on the way through? And what would be left when it moved on? Italian East Africa was a block of territory the size of Western Europe, held by something near 250,000 troops, the majority of them African. Eritrean askari battalions had served Italy since the 1880s, long enough for the uniform to become a family trade with its own status, pay scales, and pension expectations. Somali and Libyan units filled out the rest. Around it stood the British Empire's African army. The King's African Rifles from Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, Nyasaland, and Northern Rhodesia, the Sudan Defense Force, South African brigades, Indian divisions shipped up from Bombay, and inside Ethiopia, resistance to the occupation had never stopped. The Arbegnok, the Patriots, were fighting a war that for them opened in 1935 and had no connection to Poland. Italy moved first, seizing frontier positions in Sudan and Kenya through the middle of 1940, and invading British Somaliland in August. The garrison withdrew through Berbera and evacuated across the Gulf of Aden. Fascist newspapers announced the conquest of a British colony. It was also the last thing that went right. Italian East Africa carried one incurable weakness: it could not be resupplied. Royal Navy control of the Red Sea meant that whatever fuel, ammunition, aircraft engines, and spare parts sat inside the territory in June 1940 were, with rare exceptions, all there would ever be. An army in that condition does not collapse dramatically, it runs down. Aircraft become airframes, lorries become sources of parts for other lorries. Artillery hoards ammunition for the day it will matter most, which makes it useless on every other day. The Allied counteroffensive opened in January 1941 from two directions at once. William Platt drove east out of Sudan into Eritrea with Indian and British formations. Alan Cunningham pushed north out of Kenya through Italian Somaliland with African and South African brigades. Inside Ethiopia, the Patriots intensified, worked with by a small British mission that included Ord Wingate. 3 wars were being fought inside that one advance. Britain wanted the threat to the Red Sea removed. Haile Selassie, returned from exile in Bath, wanted his state restored. The African soldiers doing most of the walking and most of the dying were there for reasons that resist summary. Wages better than anything at home, a trade, a regiment that had taken their father, standing in a home district, pressure from a chief working to a quota, or the narrow set of choices available to a young man under colonial rule. Out of that came the contradiction at the center of the campaign. Eritrean askaris held the Keren ridges against Sudanese, Punjabi, and Kenyan soldiers. Africans in Italian uniform fought Africans in British uniform over an African state occupied by Italy, and the officers giving orders on both sides were European. The northern advance stopped at Keren for 8 weeks. The southern advance did the opposite, covering more than 2,500 kilometers in under 2 months, taking Mogadishu in February and reaching Addis Ababa on the 6th of April 1941, an achievement belonging as much to the transport companies as to the infantry. On the 5th of May 1941, 5 years to the day after Italian troops entered his capital, Haile Selassie walked back into Addis Ababa. The date deserves attention. In May 1941, the German army stood on the Channel coast, held Greece, and was about to take Crete. And not one European capital lost to the Axis had been recovered. The first restoration of a state conquered by fascism happened in Africa, carried out by Ethiopian fighters, Indian infantry, Sudanese, Kenyan, and Nyasa soldiers, and a South African air component. Amba Alagi surrendered on the 19th of May. The last position, at Gondar, held until November 27, 1941. By then, the Red Sea had been reclassified as outside the combat zone, which let American shipping supply Egypt directly. That single administrative decision fed everything that happened in the desert for the next 2 years, which is where the campaign people do remember was already going wrong. In September 1940, an Italian army crossed the Libyan frontier into Egypt, advanced about 100 kilometers to Sidi Barrani, and stopped, building a chain of fortified camps too far apart to support one another while it waited for supplies to catch up. On December 9th, a British force, roughly a quarter its size, attacked. Operation Compass was planned as a 5-day raid and became a rout. The 4th Indian and 7th Armored Divisions went through the gaps between the camps. When the Italians withdrew along the coast road, 7th Armored cut across the desert interior to Beta Fam and got in front of them. By 7th February 1941, the Italian 10th Army had ceased to exist, and some 130,000 prisoners had been taken. Bardia, Tobruk, and Benghazi had fallen, the first 2 assaulted by the 6th Australian Division. It was the most complete victory the British Army would win for years, and it was given away inside a month. London stripped the best of the force for Greece, where it was destroyed. In February 1941, a German general landed at Tripoli with orders to hold a defensive line and no authority to advance. Erwin Rommel advanced anyway. He attacked at the end of March with a force still assembling, cleared the weakened British out of Cyrenaica in a fortnight, and stood on the Egyptian frontier by mid-April. Everything went except one place. Tobruk held, The 9th Australian Division formed the core of the garrison, with British artillery and Indian units alongside, supplied for 8 months by destroyers and small craft running the harbor after dark. Tobruk mattered for a reason that reads as arithmetic. A division in the field consumed several hundred tons of supply a day, nearly all of it fuel, water, and ammunition. Landed in a working harbor, that tonnage cost a short run forward. Landed at Tripoli, 1,500 kilometers west, it cost a road convoy that burned a serious fraction of the fuel it carried simply to arrive. Axis propaganda called the garrison rats, and the garrison struck an unofficial medal with a rat on it. Underneath the slogans were flies in open wounds, dust in the food, unloading in the dark, and a daily ledger of rounds available against rounds fired. For 18 months, the front swung across the same 600 kilometers of coastline. Operation Crusader relieved Tobruk in November 1941 and pushed the Axis back to El Agheila. Rommel counterattacked in January and took all of it back. The names entered the military vocabulary and stayed: Sollum, Halfaya, Derna, Gazala, Knightsbridge, Bir Hakeim. The pendulum had a mechanical cause. Every advance carried its own defeat inside it, because the further an army moved from its ports, the more of its transport was consumed by transport. And a tank that cannot be refueled is a steel shed with a gun on the roof. In May 1942, Rommel attacked the Gazala line, fortified boxes strung along enormous minefields south of the coast. The southern anchor was Bir Hakeim, held by the 1st Free French Brigade under Marie-Pierre Koenig. Foreign legionnaires, alongside tirailleurs and marines from Chad, Ubangi Shari, Cameroon, and the Pacific territories. They took the weight of the assault from June 2nd, held 9 days under air attack and artillery, and withdrew on the night of the 10th in good order, having wrecked the Axis timetable where it mattered most. The rest of the line broke. On 21st June, Tobruk fell in a single day, and some 33,000 Allied troops went into captivity, the largest surrender of British Empire forces in the war after Singapore. A substantial share of them were South African, and they included men of the Native Military Corps and the Cape Corps. Black and colored soldiers sent to war as unarmed labor marched into German and Italian camps regardless. Rommel crossed into Egypt. In Cairo, British headquarters began burning files. The advance was stopped in July at a position chosen by geography rather than by any general. At El Alamein, the gap between the Mediterranean and the impassable salt marsh of the Qattara Depression closes to about 65 kilometers, the one stretch of North Africa that cannot be turned from the south. Claude Auchinleck fought the first battle there, and the line held. Both sides then rebuilt for 3 months, which favored whichever had the shorter supply line and the larger industry behind it. The Second Battle of El Alamein opened on the night of October 23, 1942, with a bombardment from more than 800 guns. Montgomery had roughly 1,000 tanks against half that number. Some 250 of them, Shermans landed at Suez and close to complete command of the air. What followed was 12 days of breaching operations against minefields 5 to 9 kilometers deep. Engineers clearing lanes by hand under fire, Australian, New Zealand, Scottish, Indian, and South African infantry taking ground in bites, armor waiting for gaps that kept closing. Italian infantry divisions, several left without transport when the withdrawal began, fought until they were overrun. On the 4th of November, the line broke and Rommel pulled out west. Churchill made El Alamein the turning of the tide, and in British memory it has stayed there. The battle was won by an army in which most of the infantry divisions in the line came from outside Britain, using tanks built in Detroit, directed by signals intelligence decrypted at Bletchley Park, against an opponent whose fuel had been sunk in the Mediterranean weeks earlier by aircraft and submarines flying out of Malta, which is the part of the African War that was decided at sea. Every German and Italian soldier in Libya stood at the end of a chain with 9 links in it. Cargo assembled in an Italian port, loaded, convoyed under escort, survived submarines, aircraft, and mines, unloaded at Tripoli, Benghazi, or Tobruk, sorted, put onto lorries, driven up a single coastal road, delivered before the fuel and water and ammunition already at the front ran out. Break any link and the army at the far end slows, whatever the talent of the man commanding it. In the middle of those sea lanes sat Malta, 60 kilometers of limestone, a fortified harbor, and a set of airfields 300 kilometers from Sicily, and about the same from the Libyan coast. Submarines, torpedo aircraft, and surface forces working out of Grand Harbor could reach the convoy routes at will. That produced the strangest arithmetic of the campaign. The Axis had to supply North Africa. The Allies had to supply Malta so that Malta could stop them. and both operations crossed the same water in opposite directions. Malta absorbed a weight of bombing per square kilometer without parallel in the war, and rationing brought it close to surrender by the middle of 1942. The convoy that saved it, Operation Pedestal in August, sailed with 14 merchant ships and delivered 5. The last, a crippled tanker held upright between 2 destroyers. When Malta was supplied, Axis shipping losses climbed steeply. When Malta was suppressed, they fell. Reading Rommel's fuel state against the tonnage sunk in the Mediterranean explains more about the shape of the Desert War than reading it against anything he decided. The Italian Navy ran that escort effort at a cost it could not sustain, and has rarely been credited for trying. Arrival in Libya solved half the problem. Tripoli lay 1,500 kilometers from Alamein. Benghazi was closer and could be bombed. Tobruk was useful only while held, and its cranes and quays were wrecked and repaired and wrecked again. Whatever came ashore had to move by road, and the coastal road became the second front. A convoy running fuel eastward consumes fuel. Push the front further from the harbor, and the proportion consumed rises until the movement stops paying for itself. Mechanical attrition destroyed more vehicles than combat did. A lorry did not need to be hit. It overheated, shed a tire, broke an axle, took in enough dust to kill an engine, or was left where it stood because no recovery vehicle could reach it. The British side had the same problem with more capacity to absorb it. A global maritime system, imperial ports at Durban, Mombasa, and Aden, 60 years of British-built workshops, depots, railways, and airfields in Egypt, and after 1941, the industrial output of the United States. As the front came east, the Allied line shortened and the Axis line stretched. None of that crossed the minefields. Men still had to do that. What logistics decided was how many guns could fire, how long they could keep firing, and whether a damaged tank was replaced within the week or written off. The campaign was carried by people absent from the photographs of it. Stevedores at Alexandria and Suez unloading through air raids. Egyptian and Sudanese railwaymen, Kenyan, Somali, and Tanganyikan porters and drivers on the East African routes. Merchant seamen, a large proportion of them Indian and Chinese lascars, on ships that burned within sight of harbor. Mechanics in the workshops at Tel El Kebir rebuilding engines that arrived full of sand. Rommel's name is on the campaign. The dock at Alexandria has no name on it at all. Who fought in Africa depends on which photograph is chosen. A German tank crew in the western desert, an Australian patrol at Tobruk, Indian sappers on the Keren ridges, the King's African Rifles walking into Ethiopia, Free French tirailleurs at Bir Hakeim, an Eritrean askari in Italian service, an American rifleman coming ashore at Casablanca. The 8th Army was British in the sense that London commanded it. Its order of battle at various points held divisions and brigades from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, India, and South Africa, with Free French, Polish, Greek, and Czech contingents alongside. A man could serve his entire war in an army called British and never see the place. Britain's African colonial forces began the war at fewer than 15,000 men. More than 500,000 Africans served in British uniform before it ended. In East Africa, in Madagascar, and in Burma, where African divisions fought through the Arakan and the Kabyle Valley. The King's African Rifles recruited across British East and Central Africa. The Royal West African Frontier Force drew from Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, and the Gambia. These were military organizations and instruments of colonial government at once, and the recruiting showed it. Some men enlisted for pay better than anything available at home, or for rations, or for a trade, or because the regiment had taken their father before them. Others were produced by chiefs and district officers working to quotas, under labor regulations that made the line between volunteering and conscription a matter of local circumstance. No single motive should be assigned to 500,000 people. A man could resent colonial rule and take pride in his battalion. He could fight well without believing a word of the propaganda. He could look for advancement inside a system designed to prevent it. The hierarchy was racial by regulation rather than by accident. African soldiers were commanded by white officers, and the commissioning of Africans was, with a handful of exceptions, not permitted. Pay, rations, quarters, medical treatment, and decorations were unequal and written down as such. Colonial authorities praised African courage in public while filing doubts about African capacity for command in private. The contradiction stood on every parade ground. Empires fighting an explicitly racist and expansionist axis maintained racial ranking inside their own armies. That does not make the two systems equivalent. Germany and Italy pursued conquest and racial persecution as declared policy, and an Axis victory in Africa would have delivered both on a scale the continent had not yet seen. Defeating them also failed to shift the inequalities inside the Allied empires by a single inch. Both things are true, and a history that drops either one is worth less than a history carrying both. South Africa carried its contradiction in the open. The Smuts government entered the war against substantial Afrikaner opposition and fielded divisions in East and North Africa. Black and colored South Africans were enrolled in the Native Military Corps and the Cape Corps, largely denied firearms, and assigned to transport, engineering, stretcher-bearing, and guard duties on lower pay. They drove the lorries, dug the positions, and carried the wounded, and they were captured at Tobruk beside the men they served. The army could segregate them. It could not run the campaign without them. Africans served the other side as well. Italy's forces in East Africa were majority African, and Libyan units fought in the Western Desert. Eritrean Askari service ran back more than 50 years, with its own traditions, pensions, and social standing, and it held at Keren and at Amba Alagi against everything sent at it. When Italian East Africa collapsed, those men's war ended in a way no European soldiers did. No repatriation, no veterans organization. In many cases, suspicion from the restored Ethiopian state and from neighbors who remembered which uniform they had worn. France's empire split in two. Chad declared for Free France in August 1940 under Félix Éboué, an administrator from French Guiana and the first man of African descent to govern a French colony, and French Equatorial Africa and Cameroon followed. That handed de Gaulle, who possessed almost nothing in Europe, real territory, tax revenue, ports, and soldiers, and from Chad, Leclerc's columns crossed the Sahara to take Kufra in early 1941 and the Fezzan 2 years after. Free France survived because Africa gave it somewhere to stand. France fell in June 1940. The French Empire did not, and its territories, fleet, garrisons, and administrators became the stakes in a French civil war fought largely on African soil. Two governments claimed the loyalty of populations never given a vote in either. Vichy held the legal apparatus and the archives. De Gaulle held a microphone in London. For a Senegalese tirailleur or an Algerian clerk, the argument over legitimate French authority was conducted above his head and enforced on his person. Britain acted first and brutally. On the 3rd of July 1940, after negotiations failed to secure or neutralize the French squadron at Mers el-Kebir near Oran, the Royal Navy opened fire and killed 1,297 French sailors. The strategic reasoning was defensible. The political cost goes a long way towards explaining why French forces in North Africa shot at Allied troops 2 years later instead of joining them. In September, a British and Free French force appeared off Dakar and invited French West Africa to change sides. The Vichy garrison and the battleship Richelieu answered with gunfire, and the operation failed inside 3 days. Central Africa went the other way, and Gabon was taken from Vichy in November 1940 in fighting between Frenchmen and between colonial soldiers on either side of them. Vichy rule brought its own program with it, and this is the part of the African war most often left out. The Statut des Juifs of October 1940 was extended into North Africa, applied differently in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia because each territory had a different legal structure. Jews were removed from the civil service, from law and medicine, from teaching. Quotas were imposed in universities, secondary schools, and, in Algeria, down to primary level. Businesses and property were placed under administration. In Algeria, the Crémieux Decree was repealed. Since 1870, it had made most Algerian Jews French citizens. In October 1940, that citizenship was withdrawn by administrative act from about 110,000 people who learned that a status held for 3 generations could be cancelled with a signature. Across French North and West Africa, Vichy ran a network of internment, penal, and labor camps: Bou Arfa in Morocco, Jelfa and Bedeau and Hadjarat McGill in Algeria, others in Guinea and Senegal. The prisoners included Spanish Republican refugees, foreign Jews, International Brigade veterans, political opponents, and men classified as undesirable by a regime that used the word freely. Conditions in some were lethal. At Hadjarat McGill, the commandant and his guards were tried after the war for torture and murder. A number of those camps existed to build the Trans-Saharan Railway, a project meant to bind the colonies together across the desert. Vichy propaganda presented it as development. It was laid by forced labor in temperatures above 50 degrees, on rations inadequate by design, with minimal shelter and almost no medical care. The desert in this story is full of camps. On November 8, 1942, Anglo-American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria. Operation Torch was the first major American ground offensive in the West, and the men coming ashore at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers were met by Vichy French forces who fought for 3 days. Several hundred Allied soldiers and around 1,300 French servicemen were killed. At Algiers, a few hundred local resistance, most of them young Jewish men from the city, seized key buildings before dawn and paralyzed the Vichy command long enough to guarantee the landing. The Allies then made their arrangement with Admiral François Darlan, the senior Vichy figure who happened to be in the city, and handed him authority over French North Africa in exchange for a ceasefire. It worked militarily. It also meant a campaign presented as liberation was administered, for a period, by the men who had written the racial laws. The Crémieux Decree was not restored until October 1943, and camps in the Sahara were still holding prisoners months after the Allies controlled the ground they stood on. The Axis reaction took 4 days. German and Italian forces flew and shipped into Tunisia. Vichy authority there evaporated under direct occupation, and Tunisia became the only Arab country to be occupied by Germany. An SS detachment under Walter Rauff reached Tunis in late November. The Jewish community leadership was ordered to produce men for labor. A fine of 20 million francs was imposed, property confiscated, hostages taken. Around 5,000 Jewish men were sent to some 30 labor camps, many working on airfields and defenses that Allied aircraft were bombing, on rations that killed the weakest of them. The occupation lasted 6 months. The brevity limited what the apparatus could build, and it is the reason Tunisia's Jewish population was not deported to Europe. 6 months is not brief to a man taken out of his house in December with no way of telling his family when or whether he is coming back. The phrase desert war does a great deal of quiet work. It suggests a battlefield with nobody living on it. Most of the fighting in North Africa followed a coastal strip a few dozen kilometers deep, and that strip held the harbors, the farmland, the olive groves, the roads, and the towns. It was the inhabited part. Benghazi changed hands 5 times. Tobruk was besieged for 8 months and stormed twice. Tripoli, Alexandria, Tunis, Bizerte, Sfax, and Valletta were bombed. Where armies arrived, they took what they needed: buildings for headquarters, vehicles, animals, fuel, food bought or requisitioned or simply removed, roads reserved for military traffic, fields crossed by tracked vehicles. Prices in Egyptian and Libyan towns rose as armies competed with civilians for the same grain and the same water. Bombs made no distinction between a military port and the streets beside it. A harbor worker at Alexandria was a civilian who spent his working day inside one of the most heavily targeted installations in the theater, and the same was true of railwaymen, mechanics, and road crews along the whole coast. Modern war reaches the front through civilian hands, which is precisely what makes those hands a target. Across colonial Africa, governments mobilized labor on a scale that has no place in the standard account. Men built roads and airfields, unloaded ships, repaired railways, cut timber, carried loads, dug defenses, and maintained camps. Some were paid. Some were enrolled in military labor units. Many were produced through chiefs, district officers, emergency powers, and compulsory service regulations that existed before the war and were used harder during it. In Kenya alone, tens of thousands of men were directed into labor under those regulations, and in northern Rhodesia and Tanganyika, the same machinery was turned on mining and agriculture in the name of war necessity. Armies consume labor the way they consume petrol. The effect reached villages that never heard a shell. When men were taken for armies or labor gangs, the farming was done by the people left behind, mostly women, on top of everything else already theirs to do. Colonial governments raised their demands for crops, cattle, tax, and raw materials at the same time, and requisitioning contributed to serious food shortages in parts of East and West Africa. When armies withdrew, the land did not go back to what it was. They left wrecked vehicles, abandoned ammunition, and minefields. The belts laid at Alamein and along the Libyan coast held millions of mines, and Libya remained among the most heavily mined countries on earth for decades. Herders, farmers, and children went on being killed by that war into the 1950s, into the 1970s, into the present. Civilian experience varied as widely as soldiers did. Some Egyptians hoped an Axis advance would weaken the British occupation. Many more feared what Italian or German rule would mean for them. Some Libyans regarded Britain as the enemy of the colonizer who had put their grandparents behind wire, and Libyan Jews in Cyrenaica were interned by the Italians at Giado, where more than 500 died of typhus and starvation. Some Tunisians hid Jewish neighbors from the labor roundups. Some traded with whoever had money. Most were trying to survive a year in which decisions taken in London, Rome, and Berlin arrived at the door in the form of an army. After Alamein, the 8th Army pursued Rommel west along 1,500 kilometers of coast. After Torch, Allied forces pushed east out of Algeria. The Axis held a shrinking bridgehead in Tunisia between the two. Finishing it took 6 months because Tunisia is not the desert of the posters. Winter rain turned the roads to mud. The Dorsale Hills gave the defenders passes to hold. German and Italian reinforcements arrived quickly enough to stop the first Allied rush at Tunis in December 1942. In February 1943, Rommel struck the inexperienced American Second Corps around Kasserine Pass and drove it back some 80 kilometers. It was a humiliation and an education. Commanders were relieved. Air support was rebuilt from the ground up, and the corps that came back under Patton and then Bradley was a different formation. Between the two Allied armies lived the Tunisians. Their farms became defensive positions, and their towns were bombed by both sides. Jewish forced laborers built airfields that Allied aircraft then attacked, which is a sentence worth reading twice. The 8th Army broke the Mareth Line in March and the Wadi Akarit position in April. On 7th May, British armor entered Tunis and American troops entered Bizerte. Axis forces in Africa surrendered on the 13th of May 1943, and something near 250,000 German and Italian soldiers went into captivity, a figure of the same order as Stalingrad 3 months before. The Mediterranean began to reopen, releasing shipping tied up on the Cape route for 3 years. The armies gathered in Africa turned north, and in July they landed in Sicily. The war moved to Europe and the public memory of it went along. The African campaign did not decide the Second World War. Germany's defeat was settled principally in the east, by economies and armies of another order of magnitude. What Africa did was hold the Suez route, consume Axis shipping and aircraft and fuel and men for 3 years, give Britain a land war it could go on fighting after 1940, hand the United States its first campaign against German forces, restore the sovereignty of Ethiopia, and supply Free France with the territory and the soldiers that made its claim credible at all. Africa is also where the invasion of Europe was assembled. Something over 1 million Africans served in the armies of the European empires during the war, and a far larger number were directed into labor for it. They came home to societies where land, rank, the franchise, and the courts were still allocated by race. Many had been trained in a trade, seen other continents, been paid in cash for the first time, and met the ruling race in conditions where its claim to natural superiority was difficult to maintain. Veterans did not all become nationalists, and the war did not create the independence movements. What it changed was what people were prepared to be told. When men who had fought fascism in the name of freedom were refused pensions, refused land, and refused the vote, the argument became harder to answer with every year that passed. In Accra on February 28, 1948, police fired on a march of ex-servicemen walking to Christiansborg Castle to present a petition about their pensions. 3 of them were killed. The riots that followed put the Gold Coast on the road to becoming Ghana 9 years later. Recognition ran along the same lines the pay scales had. European generals wrote memoirs and were played by film stars. Armored divisions received official histories. African soldiers were entered under regimental numbers where they were entered at all, and the porters and laborers were counted as expenditure. Across East and West Africa, the Commonwealth War cemeteries carry memorials to men whose names were never collected, and the reasoning recorded at the time was that their communities would not visit graves. That decision was investigated and publicly apologized for in 2021. The pattern holds. We remember the general who ordered the advance and not the driver who brought the fuel, the tank and not the dock, the battle and not the requisitioned harvest. Go back to the ridge above Keren and the mule track cut into the rock and the water coming up in canvas bags. Nobody on that mountain was a supporting character in another continent's war. The men climbing and the men waiting for them, the drivers on the coast road, the stevedores at Alexandria, the laborers laying rail across the Sahara under guard, the family in Tunis listening for aircraft, that was the campaign. The whole of it was carried on their backs, across a continent nobody had thought to ask.